Hi again, welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, Christian IV of Denmark intervened in the growing religious conflict in the Holy Roman Empire, trying to protect his Protestant co-religionists and make some money on the way. It didn't quite turn out that way though, and instead he was lucky to disentangle himself from the fighting that would last for 30 years without having to give up any territory. The only thing he had to do was to promise never to interfere in German affairs again. Then he was left in peace to tend to his wounded pride. Following his victory against the Danes, Emperor Ferdinand believed the war in the north was basically over and turned his attention elsewhere. Today, we'll see why that may have been a rash decision. Episode 86, The Lion from the North. As you probably remember, Karl IX of Sweden died in the middle of the Kalmar War and was succeeded by his son, Gustavus Adolphus. According to a popular tradition, the dying king is supposed to have said, "Ille facit," which is Latin for, "he'll do it," hoping his heir would finish the job he had started. And even though it's probably true that Karl IX had high hopes for his son, he almost definitely didn't say this. First of all, the very first source mentioning this quote is from 1676, decades after both Karl and his son were long gone. Secondly, Karl IX didn't speak Latin. Anyway, in 1611, Gustavus Adolphus inherited not only his father's crown, but also his war with Denmark. And that wasn't the only war Gustavus Adolphus inherited from his father. Sweden had been involved in conflicts on the other side of the Baltic Sea before and during the Kalmar War, and it continued after peace with the Danes had been concluded as well. In the east, Sweden was fighting both Poland and Russia. We've already covered the reason for the conflict with Poland. Karl IX had usurped his nephew, Sigismund, and stolen his Swedish crown. But since Sigismund was still king of Poland, he had plenty of resources to throw at his uncle, and now his cousin, Gustavus Adolphus. Sigismund may no longer have been actively pursuing the Swedish crown, but he hadn't given up the claim to it, and he wasn't prepared to see the Swedes expand their influence in what he, and most of the Poles, considered the Polish sphere of influence in the Baltics. The Swedes did not accept this view, and felt they had every right to interfere in Eastern European affairs as they saw fit. In the early 17th century, the Eastern European affair to interfere in was Russia. The country was in disarray following the extinction of the ruling family. The Swedes were trying to take advantage of this chaos and put a Swede on the Russian throne. In 1610, a Swedish army even managed the notoriously difficult feat of marching to and capturing Moscow, something a number of later and greater armies will famously fail to do. The Swedish candidate to be the next Tsar was Carl Philip, younger brother of Gustavus Adolphus, and on February 7th, 1613, the Russian crown was actually officially offered to Carl Philip. But his mom, the Dowager Queen of Sweden, refused to let her 12-year-old son travel to Russia to take up the job. And maybe that was for the best, because already 2 weeks later, on February 21st, another, and from a Russian perspective preferable candidate, was given the job instead. He was not only a Russian, but he was also both a grown man and present in Russia at the time. His name was Michael Romanov, and his family would famously rule Russia until 1917. The election of Michael Romanov brought Sweden and Russia to war. The King of Sweden couldn't accept that his little brother, who had been offered the position, was sidestepped like this. Gustavus Adolphus traveled to Viborg, the Finnish city at the eastern border of the kingdom, preparing for a campaign in Russia. He was eager to show the Russians what a mistake they had made. This eagerness was not shared by his advisors, and most notably not by his Chancellor of the Realm, Axel Oxenstierna. Oxenstierna did what he could to stop the king from going, not because he was against the war per se, but because he was afraid the king might fall in battle. If Gustavus Adolphus were to die, there would be no adult male member of the Vasa family left who could inherit the crown and rule Sweden. Well, with the glaring exception of Sigismund Vasa in Poland, of course, but that just compounded the problem. If Gustavus Adolphus would die, his cousin could swoop in and reclaim the Swedish crown, and that was a turn of events that very few leading Swedes wanted. So Chancellor Oxenstierna went after the king, traveling across the Baltic Sea. When he caught up with Gustavus Adolphus, he convinced the king that he was needed in Stockholm. Some super critical decisions needed to be made by the king, in person, right now. The king was convinced, went home, and left the fighting in Russia to other, more expendable people. And those expendable people did a good job, despite the king's absence. They conquered both Novgorod and Ingria, but Russia was huge, and the Russians didn't give up, so the war kept going. In 1615, Gustavus Adolphus wanted to go back and take direct control again, and this time not even Oxenstierna managed to keep him in Sweden. It was obvious that Gustavus Adolphus enjoyed the fighting. He found battles exciting and was always found in the thick of things. No doubt this caused many sleepless nights for the Chancellor and other members of the Council of the Realm. Peace with Russia was finally achieved in early 1617. The two sides met in Stolbova and signed the agreement in February that year. In the negotiations, Sweden had demanded a big chunk of land, effectively cutting Russia off from both the Arctic Ocean and the Baltic Sea. If their demands would have been met, Russia would have become a landlocked minor power at the margins of Europe. They didn't get all they asked for, though, but they still got quite a lot. Lake Ladoga, Europe's largest freshwater lake, became the border between Finland and Russia. That way, the Swedes were convinced they had a buffer on the eastern border and that the kingdom could no longer be threatened from the east. As Gustavus Adolphus put it, the Russians wouldn't be able to jump across. In addition, both Kexholm and Ingria became Swedish possessions, blocking Russia from the Gulf of Finland and creating a land connection between Finland and Estonia. In return, the Swedes had to recognize Michael Romanov as the legitimate Tsar of Russia, which meant that the king's little brother would have to look for another job. Not that young Carl Philip didn't have anything to do. He had joined his brother, the king, in his next venture, now when the war against Russia was over, namely a new war against Poland. Sigismund still insisted that he was the only legitimate king of Sweden, and it was getting increasingly embarrassing for Gustavus Adolphus. Beyond the awkward legal situation, there were also lots of rumors going around, claiming that Sigismund was scheming to do something to get his Swedish crown back. Today we can say with a fairly high degree of certainty that Sigismund didn't really pose any real danger to Gustavus Adolphus. The King of Poland didn't have the personality or the power required to do what it took to actually fight his way back onto the Swedish throne. But Gustavus Adolphus and the people surrounding him didn't know that. They constantly worried about a surprise attack from Poland. In the king's mind, the threat to his crown from his Polish relatives and the threat of Catholicism mixed together. Sigismund, the Jesuits, the Pope, and the Devil were all in league with each other as far as the King of Sweden was concerned. Catholicism was both a political and a religious threat. To counter this perceived threat, new anti-Catholic laws were introduced. Now it was enshrined in law that you could not be both Swedish and Catholic. All Catholics in the realm were given 3 months to leave. Any Catholic found in Sweden or Finland after that grace period would face the death penalty. It also became forbidden to study at Catholic universities abroad, and, perhaps most critically, no Swede was allowed to be in contact with Sigismund Vasa, his family, or any Swede who had left the country to join the ex-king in Poland. In addition, all letters from Poland had to be handed over to the authorities as soon as they arrived in Sweden. Following the introduction of these laws, the persecution of Swedish Catholics was ramped up. Suspected Catholics were arrested and even tortured to confess real or imagined crimes. People were executed for participating in or aiding Sigismund's plans to invade Sweden, plans that didn't exist except in the head of the Swedish authorities. Based on interrogation protocols, we know what worried the authorities. The prisoners were asked how Sigismund was planning his invasion, which Swedes were helping him, and how they were secretly spreading Catholicism in Sweden. The interrogators demanded that the prisoners name crypto-Catholics in Sweden, name Swedes who had studied at Catholic universities, and name people who had been in contact with Sigismund or anyone associated with him. The elimination of this threat was one of the main goals with the new war against Poland. But, like so often, there was also another economic goal. For generations, Sweden and Poland had been fighting over control of the Baltic ports through which the trade to and from Russia passed. Simply put, the Poles wanted Estonia from Sweden, and Sweden wanted Livonia, roughly today's Latvia, from Poland. This was a fight that predated the struggle over the Swedish crown. You may even remember that Sigismund won the election to become King of Poland, partly thanks to a vague promise to help pry Estonia away from Sweden. The war began great for the Swedes. They managed to capture Livonia, including the port city of Riga, today the capital of Latvia, which fell in September 1621. Capturing Riga was an old Swedish dream, since the city was rich and controlled so much of the trade with Russia that the Swedes wanted to tax. To make sure this wouldn't be a temporary occupation that the Swedes would have to give up in a future peace deal with the Poles, Riga was tied closely to Sweden from the beginning, and the city was even granted the right to send delegates to the Swedish Riksdag. But even though taking Riga was a triumph for the Swedes, it came at a high price. During the siege of the city, an epidemic had swept through the camp, and many of the soldiers had died. One of those soldiers was none other than Carl Philip, the king's younger brother. Now Gustavus Adolphus was the only male left in the Swedish branch of the Vasa dynasty. If something happened to him, there would be chaos. Maybe war with Poland, maybe a civil war. Nothing could be allowed to happen to the king before he had sired a male heir. But the problem was that the king kept taking risks. He loved the thrill of the battle, and he was often found in the front line, urging his soldiers on, engaging in face-to-face combat with the enemy. In the war against Poland, Gustavus Adolphus was wounded not once, but twice. But that didn't change his behavior. He continued taking risks, and his chancellor and other advisors kept lying awake at night, praying and hoping for the best. By 1626, all of Livonia was in Swedish hands. The second goal had been achieved, but the Poles refused to sue for peace, and Sigismund still insisted that he and no one else was the rightful king of Sweden. So the Swedes decided to press on. The next logical target for the Swedish army was East Prussia, with its rich port cities where the great rivers Pregolia, Vistula, and Niemen flowed into the Baltic Sea. Capturing the Prussian coast would mean increasing tax revenues for Sweden and a weakened Poland. Taking the important cities like Danzig would also rob the Poles of ports from which to ship an invasion army across the Baltic Sea to Sweden. In June 1626, Swedish troops entered East Prussia. They met with little resistance and mostly marched around taking fortresses without running into any significant Polish forces. The Poles chose to keep their distance and instead focused on sabotaging the Swedish supply lines, hoping that would force the invaders out. But the Swedes kept their grip on the Prussian ports. This meant that the Poles couldn't export their grain, which in turn meant that they lost great sums in lost income each year. So the pressure grew on Sigismund to open peace negotiations with his Swedish cousin Gustavus Adolphus. But at the same time, there were a number of influential players on the international stage who did what they could to keep the war going. For instance, already in 1627, the imperial commander Wallenstein, the one who looked like a supervillain, said that if the Swedes managed to disengage their troops from the war in Poland, they would become an enemy more dangerous than the Turk to the Holy Roman Empire. But even though the Habsburgs wanted the Poles to keep the Swedes busy in East Prussia, there was a limit to how much the Poles could take. And after 3 years, they had had enough. Sigismund was forced to sue for peace. Thanks to French and English mediation, Sweden and Poland agreed to a 6-year truce in September 1629. According to the terms of the agreement, Sweden got to keep Livonia and the Prussian harbors all the way to Danzig. This doubled the incomes of the Swedish government in one fell swoop. The war against Poland had been important not only because it drastically increased the crown's income. The Swedish army leadership also drew important lessons, and the armed forces were reformed to fight better and more effectively. A larger and more professional army was chiseled out with better commanders. It was no longer enough to be born into a noble family and know how to ride on a horse to become an officer. From now on, you had to undergo actual training, forging a more professional officer corps. The Swedes also went from fighting in closed formations, the so-called Spanish square formation, to fighting in lines. Even though the bulk of the army still consisted of peasants, these peasants were now trained in fighting techniques, increasing the effectiveness and discipline during battle. The cavalry also changed its way of fighting. Instead of turning back immediately after firing their guns, the riders now would go on to attack with their sabers. The Swedish artillery also changed. It switched to lighter cannons, which were easier to move, making it possible to travel faster and even to change their position during battle. All of these changes would bear fruit in the coming years, because even though the war against Poland was now drawing to a close, that didn't mean that Gustavus Adolphus was done fighting. As you hopefully remember from last episode, it was around this time Christian IV of Denmark turned to the King of Sweden and begged for help in his fight against the imperial army in northern Germany. Ever since the late 16th century, as imperial pressure started to ramp up, German Protestants had been talking about a prophecy of a savior from the north that would come and deliver them from the Roman Babylon and usher in a new golden age for humanity. After defeating the emperor, this northern savior would then go on to conquer all of Europe and even bits of Africa and Asia. Peace and harmony would reign in his realm, and people there would await the second coming of Christ and the imminent judgment day. Here and there throughout the Lutheran parts of the Holy Roman Empire, people even reported that they had seen visual versions of this prophecy. In these visions, random German Protestants claimed that they had seen a lion coming from the north and how he'd fought an eagle in the sky. In the end, the lion triumphed and the eagle was chased off. The eagle in this context was the symbol of the Holy Roman Empire, and the lion was interpreted to represent a king from the north. As the imperial armies won more and more battles, the dreams of a divine intervention grew more fervent, and the visions of lions fighting eagles multiplied. This symbolism was old and established at the time. European empires tended to use an eagle as their symbol, referring back to the Roman Empire and its eagle. Just look at the coat of arms of not only the Holy Roman Empire, but also the Byzantine Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Second German Empire, and Napoleon's Empire. All like to be compared to or associated with ancient Rome in one way or another, so they all featured a version of the Roman eagle on their coat of arms. Similarly, European kingdoms tended and still tend to use prominently featured lions in their heraldry. Just look at the coat of arms of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the United Kingdom. Even Finland, which obviously is a republic today, uses a lion as its national symbol, a relic from its past connections to the Swedish monarchy. This royal lion ultimately finds its roots in the biblical tradition, where the kings of Israel are referred to as the Lion of Judah. This is also why the city of Jerusalem sports a lion on its coat of arms. And since the pious European medieval monarchs, steeped in theology and religious lore, held up King David and King Solomon as ideal examples of kingship, it's not particularly surprising that they chose the lion to represent them. So the basic meaning of the lion fighting the eagle was clear, but even though it was obvious to everyone who the eagle was supposed to represent, the identity of the lion was more unclear. In the last episode, we saw that Christian IV of Denmark believed it could be him, and how that ended up in defeat and humiliation. But he wasn't the only king residing north of the Holy Roman Empire. Also, Gustavus Adolphus found the prophecies about the lion from the north intriguing. Because of his many years fighting his Catholic cousin Sigismund, he developed an understanding of his own mission in life as defending Sweden from re-Catholicization, which threatened if his Polish cousin, who still claimed the Swedish crown, would be victorious. It wasn't a particularly big step to expand this to include Protestants generally, who needed to be defended from the imperial threat. By now, Gustavus Adolphus was convinced it was his destiny to fight Catholicism, and that the prophecies referred to him. Even though not everyone in Sweden was convinced throwing the country into yet another expensive war on the continent was such a brilliant idea. The French ambassador, though, to Sweden encouraged the king to think that he was, in fact, the Lion of the North at a meeting in February 1630. Let me just point out once again that it may seem strange that the representative from the very Catholic France would try to convince the Lutheran king of Sweden to fight in defense of put-upon German Protestants. But, as I explained last time, this had less to do with religion and more to do with the French strategic goal of undermining the Habsburgs, who threatened France from both the south and the east. And the French didn't limit themselves to encouraging words. France had recently beaten down its own Protestants, the Huguenots, so they were now free to support the Protestant king of Sweden in his fight against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. In a fortuitous coincidence, Spain was also running out of money to fight the Netherlands at this time, so the Dutch also had money and resources to spare, which they were willing to invest in a Swedish intervention in the growing religious conflict. That meant Gustavus Adolphus now had the backing to throw his army out of the Polish frying pan and into the German fire. Meanwhile, the emperor thought the war against the Protestants had been won and his forces had defeated the Danes. As I mentioned last time, after the peace in Lübeck, the emperor had started to de-escalate in northern Germany. He was shifting his troops to northern Italy, where he needed them for another war that we won't get into here because this isn't the Mantuan History podcast. Most Protestant princes in the Holy Roman Empire greeted this development with relief. They too were eager to end the war and put the religious conflict with the Catholics to bed once again, at least until the emperor hit them with the Edict of Restitution, demanding the return of all property that had been Catholic as far back as half a century ago. Meanwhile, in Sweden, the nobility was far less interested than the king in getting involved in the religious war on the continent. For good reason. They worried that Sweden wouldn't be able to handle yet another war that could go on for who knew how long. They doubted that the country had sufficient manpower both to raise yet another army and to work the land and keep the economy going at home. They noted that all the wars in the East had led to the death of too many able-bodied men who would be needed on their farms. How would they be able to stamp another army out of the ground when, as they put it, the land is quite desolate as it is? In the end, though, Gustavus Adolphus and his backers managed to convince the council. First of all, the king argued that the war was already a fact. Swedish troops had already been shipped off to fight imperial forces in northern Germany. So in for a penny, in for a pound, right? Secondly, a war in Germany would hopefully give Sweden control over all the ports on the German Baltic Sea coast. During the war against Poland, Sweden had captured all the eastern ports, so this would create a Dominium Maris Baltici, or complete Swedish control over the Baltic Sea coast. Ruling all these rich port cities would be an enormous boon to the Swedish economy, immediately increasing the tax revenues far beyond what they were able to obtain within the kingdom's current borders. The war would not only pay for itself, it would make Sweden wealthy beyond their wildest imagination. Thirdly, Protestant Europe was under threat from the Holy Roman Empire and the Emperor's aggressive Catholic offensive. Even if Sweden didn't join the fight to stop this offensive, they might still find themselves at war with the Empire sooner rather than later, and then under far less favorable conditions. Or, as the king explained, we either meet them in Stralsund or await them in Kalmar. So from the Swedish perspective, the war would be both a preemptive strike to defend the kingdom and a defense of German Protestants. The fact that they were also expected to gain economically didn't mean that all the talk of religion was merely disingenuous rhetoric, as some people from later, more secularized ages have liked to believe. We have no reason to conclude that Gustavus Adolphus and the people surrounding him didn't actually believe that they were doing God's work by defending Protestantism against a perceived Catholic threat. It's probably worth mentioning, though, that this perceived threat was just that, perceived. We have no real indication that the emperor had a real plan to expand into the Baltic Sea or beyond, at least not at this point. As I've already noted repeatedly, he was happy to have fended off the Danes and was now turning his attention to Italy. But Emperor Ferdinand would soon have to turn his attention northward again. In 1629, the Riksdag approved the war and the required raising of taxes to fund it. But the estates had two conditions. First, the war with Poland had to end before the new one in Germany could start. Second, it was of critical importance that the new war was kept in Germany. Representatives from the peasant estate stressed that they should let the goat gnaw at the enemy's turf. In May 1630, Gustavus Adolphus gave a speech to the estates before leaving for Germany. In it, he reiterated that the war was to defend Sweden and the true religion against papism. He also stressed the risk he was taking personally, saying that the jar that is carried to the well often enough eventually breaks. No doubt there were plenty of people listening to that speech thinking that if the king was aware of the risk he was taking, maybe he should just put the jar down. They were all keenly aware that the king, who was setting off to personally lead his men into battle in Germany, did not yet have a male heir, only a 4-year-old daughter. The king wasn't the only one risking his life in this war, though. In the spring of 1630, recruited peasant soldiers had been on the move throughout the kingdom, traveling to the ports from which they were to be shipped off to war. The army was large, so no one port city had the capacity to house all the soldiers. Up and down the Swedish and Finnish coasts, soldiers were gathering. Even though the lion's share of the army would be made up of Swedish peasants as usual, Swedish agents were also busy recruiting mercenaries in the Netherlands, Scotland, England, northern Germany, Poland, and even in Denmark. All in all, an army under Gustavus Adolphus's command consisted of some 38,000 men. But unlike the king, who was eager to see action again, quite a few of these soldiers were easily able to curb their enthusiasm about the upcoming war. Approximately 10% of the conscripted peasants in Sweden chose to desert before the fleet even set sail for Germany. In Finland, that number was twice as high. 20% of the Finnish soldiers never even showed up to their port of embarkation. At the same time as the soldiers were streaming into the ports, a large number of people were busy baking bread and brewing beer to cover as much as possible of the needs of the army and the fleet. Beer was the beverage of choice back then, because the water was often contaminated. This bread and beer also needed to be transported to the various ports. Then, all the ships needed to be ready to set sail to meet up for the final crossing of the Baltic Sea. All of this was a complicated logistic operation in a time when communications were unreliable and slow. In the end, the fleet was ready and gathered in May 1630. After having waited for good wind for about 2 weeks, the fleet could finally set sail on June 11th. It consisted of no fewer than 120 vessels, both transport and warships. The voyage was long and tricky because of wind conditions, but on June 26th, they could finally see the German shoreline come into view. At around 4 in the afternoon, the first Swedish troops started to disembark on the island of Usedom off the coast of Pomerania, very close to the spot where Christian IV had landed his troops 2 years before. It had been a hot summer's day, but with almost too perfect timing. As the Swedish soldiers were wading ashore, thunder from an approaching storm could be heard in the distance. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast, even if you're worried that the goat will eventually come to gnaw at your turf. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop, or if you just crave more content at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.